Baby, I'm all shook up since you walked my way. Oh yeah, all shook up.
Morning arrived gently in the small coastal town of San Isidro, where the sun always rose slowly, as if it too admired the quiet life below. The waves curled softly onto the shore, carrying with them the scent of salt and seaweed. And above all the natural whispers of the village came another sound, one that had started long before dawn, one that people had come to recognize without even trying. It was the voice of a young man singing old Elvis melodies, drifting across the narrow streets like a warm breeze. The voice felt too big for the town, too full of soul for a life so simple. Yet every morning, without fail, it rose from a small wooden house that stood near the edge of the market. Inside lived Ramon de la Cruz, a 24-year-old delivery boy with shy eyes and a heart far bigger than his dreams. He had grown up with little, but he carried himself with a softness that made people trust him instantly. His neighbors said his voice carried something familiar, an echo of an era they had only heard about, a sound that reminded them of old radios and lost memories. Ramon never thought of himself as special. He simply sang because the world felt kinder when he did. The cracked walls of his home became a stage, the early light became a spotlight, and the rusted speaker in the corner became the orchestra he never had. His mother, Alma, often watched him from the doorway. She admired how music changed him, how his timid posture opened, how his fears faded, how his eyes glowed with something she knew the world needed to see. She remembered how, as a child, he used to hum Elvis songs his father once played on a battered cassette player. That memory became his anchor, long after life became heavy. One quiet morning, as Ramon sang near the market after finishing a delivery, a visiting tourist paused to record him with a small camera. It was a simple moment, unnoticed by Ramon, yet it carried the weight of destiny. By the next sunrise, the days that followed felt unreal for Ramon. What began as a simple recording by a passing tourist had found its way into thousands of screens around the world. People shared it with captions full of wonder, calling him a voice from another time, a Filipino Elvis, a soul the world had been waiting for. Messages filled his inbox, each one kinder than the last. Yet among them was one message that made Ramon's hands tremble, the official invitation to audition for America's Got Talent. The news spread quickly through San Isidro. Neighbors gathered outside his home, offering warm smiles and blessings. His mother held his hands, steadying him the way she had done since he was a boy. She reminded him that some opportunities come once in a lifetime, and the world was finally knocking on his door. Ramon didn't feel like a star, but he knew he couldn't turn away from something that felt so much like destiny. Leaving home was harder than he expected. The bus ride to the airport felt long and heavy, carrying every memory of the life he had known. The moment he stepped into the plane, the world expanded beyond anything he had ever imagined. The endless sky outside the window felt like a reminder that dreams didn't belong to a chosen few, they belonged to anyone brave enough to chase them. When he reached Los Angeles, the noise, the lights, and the towering buildings made him feel small. He clutched his old backpack, the same one he used during deliveries, as if it held pieces of home. He rented a tiny bed in a shared hostel, surrounded by strangers, but every night he would stand in the narrow hallway and practice Elvis songs softly, letting his nerves melt into the melody. People noticed him, not because he tried, but because sincerity has a way of shining quietly. Other contestants found comfort in his gentle nature. Crew members admired how he greeted everyone with humble gratitude. Even in the midst of competition, Ramon carried kindness like a lantern. He still didn't believe he belonged on such a grand stage. But he knew he had to try. And somewhere inside him, hope was beginning to grow. The morning of the audition felt heavier than any morning Ramon had ever lived. He woke before the sun, sitting quietly on the edge of his hostel bed, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside. He held his father's old necklace in his hand, a small pendant worn thin by years of touch. It was all he had left of the man who first introduced him to Elvis. Today, he wore it close to his heart. As he entered the AGT studio, the atmosphere wrapped around him like a storm of excitement. Camera crews rushed across the floor. Contestants rehearsed in corners. Audience members lined up with buzzing anticipation. Ramon felt overwhelmed by the intensity, yet strangely grounded by something deeper, the belief that music had carried him here for a reason. A staff member guided him backstage. The curtains ahead glowed with bright stage lights, creating a silhouette of the world he was about to face. He could hear the crowd cheering for the performer before him, their applause shaking the floor beneath his feet. His pulse quickened, but he closed his eyes long enough to remember the sound of waves hitting the San Isidro shore. That memory steadied him like an anchor. When his name was announced, he stepped out slowly. The stage was larger than anything he had ever known. The judges' table stood under a wash of white lights. The audience stretched upward like a vast sea of faces. Ramon felt small, yet for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. He felt ready. The spotlight warmed his skin, outlining the quiet determination in his eyes. The world around him blurred into a soft haze. All he could hear was his own breathing, steady and sure. And then the music began. With the first note, something inside him unlocked. His voice rose gently, carrying the warmth of old memories and the weight of his hopes. It wasn't just Elvis he was channeling, it was the boy who sang in the early mornings, the son who sang to forget hunger, the dreamer who believed music could heal something inside him. The audience fell silent, captured by a voice filled with history and heart. The judges leaned in. Even Simon's expression softened, as if he sensed that this moment held something rare. Ramon sang like he had waited his whole life for this one breath. And the world listened. The final note hung in the air like a delicate thread, trembling softly before fading into silence. For a moment, the entire auditorium stood frozen. No whispers. No movements. Not even the creak of a chair. It was as if everyone had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Ramon stood in the center of the stage, his chest rising and falling, his eyes lowered as he tried to steady himself. He didn't dare look up yet. He didn't know what the audience thought. He didn't know if he had done enough. All he knew was that he had given them the purest piece of his heart. Slowly, he lifted his gaze. What he saw next would remain with him for the rest of his life. The crowd began to rise, not with explosive noise at first, but with a gentle, growing wave of admiration. One row stood, then another, until hundreds of people were on their feet, applauding with a passion that felt almost overwhelming. Their faces glowed with something more than excitement. It was warmth. Gratitude. Awe. And at the judges' table, Simon Cowell sat differently than he ever had before. His posture had softened. His eyes, usually sharp and evaluating, carried a quiet shine. His expression wasn't the usual measured stare the world had grown familiar with. Instead, something rare had broken through, a genuine, unguarded smile. Not the polite smile he sometimes gave for TV. Not the amused smirk he offered contestants he found charming. This one was deeper. It was the kind of smile that came from remembering something precious. A smile that carried nostalgia, respect, and something almost emotional. A smile that seemed to say he had just witnessed the purity of music again, the kind of performance that reminded him why talent shows existed in the first place. The lights reflected softly across Simon's face, capturing the moment as the audience roared louder. The other judges stood, clapping with visible admiration, but Simon didn't rush. He stayed seated for a few seconds longer, simply watching Ramon with quiet appreciation, letting the smile settle like sunlight after a long storm. Only then did he rise to his feet, a gesture so rare, so sincere, it sent a wave of emotion through the room. Backstage crew members peeked from behind curtains, stunned by what they were seeing. Contestants waiting for their turn felt goosebumps ripple across their skin. Even the camera operators paused, knowing they were capturing a moment that would replay in millions of hearts. Ramon stood motionless, overwhelmed. He didn't understand the magnitude of what had just happened. But he felt it, deep, warm, and life-changing. A Filipino boy with a borrowed dream had just made one of the toughest judges in the world smile like never before. Backstage felt different the moment Ramon stepped behind the curtain. The air was thick with emotion, buzzing with the echo of applause that still trembled through the walls. Crew members watched him with softened eyes, some smiling, some wiping away quiet tears. He walked slowly, unsure of where to place his hands, unsure of what to feel. Everything seemed unreal, almost dreamlike, as if he were floating rather than standing on solid ground. He leaned against a wall and closed his eyes. His heart was still racing from the performance, but beneath the rush was something deeper, something warm, something steady. He felt as though a door inside his life had opened, letting in a light he never expected to see. While he tried to calm his breathing, the world outside was exploding with energy he did not yet know about. The audience continued cheering long after he left the stage. Cameras replayed his performance in slow motion. Producers gathered around monitors, whispering with excitement. And online, thousands of people began searching for the quiet Filipino boy who sang like he carried the weight of another era in his voice. Across the ocean, in the small town of San Isidro, neighbors crowded around tiny televisions and phones. Alma sat on the edge of their couch, her hands pressed to her lips as she watched her son stand on one of the biggest stages in the world. When she saw the audience rise, and Simon's rare smile, tears fell freely down her cheeks. For the first time in years, she felt the heaviness of their struggles lift, replaced by pride and hope. Messages poured into Ramon's social media accounts, people from different countries telling him he had touched something in them, reminding them of memories, healing old wounds, bringing joy they hadn't felt in a long time. They called him the Filipino Elvis the world needed, a title that felt far too big for him, yet also strangely fitting. Standing backstage, he allowed himself to breathe more deeply. The world had seen him. Truly seen him. And in that moment, he realized something important. He didn't just sing to escape his life, he sang to connect with something larger than himself. When he returned to the stage for the results days later, he walked with a steadier step. Not because he knew he had already won anything, but because he understood that the journey itself had transformed him. He carried his hometown in his heart, his mother's hopes in his soul, and his father's music in his voice. And somewhere in the crowd, Simon watched him again, still smiling. A simple boy from a quiet town had changed the world in a single performance. And his story was only beginning.